You're listening to a Frequency Podcast Network production.
He's in the building!
Drink the moment. Drink it.
I said empty your mind.
Coquettish and coy. Ow. Ow.
What?
Yeah, there's people that are dying.
The wickedly talented.
More than great. It was historic.
Crack is
Wow.
Oh, good for you.
I have to apologize.
One of the hottest.
Hello, and welcome back to The Reheat, a podcast that re-examines the hottest celebrity news and scandals of yesteryear and asks, how would we react to the same events if they'd transpired today? I'm your co-host, Sarah Sahagian.
And I'm Sadaf Hassan, your other co-host. And in today's episode, we're going to talk all things Brendan Fraser, aka the hilarious heartthrob, or as we would refer to him today, himbo, who led many very 90s films, including The Mummy, George of the Jungle, and my personal favorites, Bedazzled and Blast from the Past. Yes, I'm not kidding. Although he tended to kill it at the box office, he was also often the butt of the joke in Hollywood because, remember, this is before we fell in love with the Channing Tatum types, who is absolutely Brendan Fraser 2.0, by the way. And before we decided silly hot men are actually really funny and harmless and worth our attention. Now, while Brendan owned the 90s, there came a long decade after in which we didn't hear much from him, but not because his career fizzled out, or he did or said something messy, or aged out of Hollywood. A lot of it has to do with his reveal in recent years that he was sexually assaulted by a Hollywood figure, which may have led to his blacklisting, but also made him one of very few men to come forward during the industry's Me Too era, when many famous women revealed their experiences of assault. Now, before we dig into his trajectory, Sarah, which of Brendan's films really defined the 90s, would you say?
Okay, I mean, which one defined the 90s?
In your opinion.
My favorite is Blast from the Past. That was a real classic in the Sahagian household. It's a truly underrated comedy. If you like history, if you are sort of an amateur historian, I think you will genuinely find this funny. It's a great satire of Cold War politics, even though I don't think most people know that.
No, they don't.
No, but it's very insightful. I would say his most iconic performance in retrospect is George of the Jungle, probably at the time, The Mummy. What do you think?
Oh God, The Mummy, absolutely. I just remember those little tendrils of his hair going down over his brow. Oh, now, did you even know that there was a reason for his disappearance, by the way? Did you notice that he'd kind of stepped out of Hollywood a little?
I noticed that he receded from the spotlight a little bit. I think like a lot of people, I just sort of assumed maybe he didn't want to, stay in ridiculous shape anymore. Maybe he was kind of sick of that. And maybe he just wanted to sit at home and count his millions, as I would probably do if I had made that much money.
God, I wish. I would want to smell them all day. That's what I would do. Now, why don't we look back at how Brendan's career began before we dig a little bit deeper? He is, first of all, Canadian-American, and in fact would become the first American to make it onto Canada's Walk of Fame. Go us. He was born in Indiana to Canadian parents and then grew up all over, from California to Ottawa to Switzerland. He eventually ended up attending school in Toronto, and after giving acting a shot at a New York college, he decided to skip his master's in favor of going directly to Hollywood. And his path to stardom did not take long, with his first role coming just a year later in 1992 with Encino Man. How does one describe Encino Man? Well, Brendan plays a caveman who was frozen in ice and recovered and awakened in the 20th century when a few dorky teens find him in their backyard. It's horrible, I'll be honest with you.
My husband loves this movie. He loves it.
Well, you know what I will say to your husband's credit, it is a good bad movie, right? Brendan did a lot of those. And those
Yeah, no, I don't think he thinks it's a masterpiece, but he cites it oftentimes as like an influential movie that like teaches young men how to talk to girls because like the caveman's got game.
Well, it is a cult classic. In fact, a lot of Brendan's movies were. So it co-stars Sean Astin and Pauly Shore for reference. And it also really cemented the way that he would be typecast for years as a goof. It obviously got terrible reviews, but it also was a massive box office success, believe it or not. That same year, he starred in School Ties, a sports drama that I insist everybody give a watch because not only is it low-key great, but it starred Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Cole Hauser, Chris O'Donnell, and Anthony Rapp when they were also super young and just starting out. Needless to say, Brendan started out as a part of that crew. He was primed to match their paths and was in the same box as fellow Canadian actor Keanu Reeves. Sarah, why do you think some of these men and their careers went in one direction, but Brendan's kind of went off in another? What forms that path and decides who gets to be a certain kind of movie star?
Well, he actually kind of in some ways had a similar trajectory to Chris O'Donnell, who has found
Yes.
a second career on TV. But I think what distinguishes some of these people from others, I mean, Keanu got lucky with The Matrix, that became a huge, huge franchise. And
Yeah.
he's a fantastic actor. He's super handsome. He's charismatic. So, I mean, part of the luck was he was born with those attributes and therefore was cast. But had he not been Neo, who knows if he'd be an icon today. In the case of Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, they made Good Will Hunting. They wrote an opportunity for
Yeah.
themselves to showcase their abilities, and really inserted themselves as Hollywood players at a young age and are big producers. And they, Ben Affleck still writes and directs movies that are critically acclaimed quite frequently. So I think that Brendan, if you just want to be an actor, you have a harder path in Hollywood today, I think, if that's all you want to do, if you just want to act. And I feel bad for those people because, you shouldn't have to have multiple jobs to be successful in any industry.
Yeah,
In any industry.
totally.
But I think you really do in contemporary Hollywood.
I think so too. And I love my Boston boys. And I think you're right. There's a difference when you create your work for yourself and when you sort of take the roles that are offered to you. And Brendan was clearly offered a certain type and he kind of kept saying yes to those roles. I don't know if you remember, Sarah, but I often think about Brendan Fraser's pinup spread in Premiere Magazine, which actually recently resurfaced online and had everybody lusting after him. So, he very clearly had a certain kind of reputation. And that kind of doesn't last forever because bodies like that don't last forever.
No, it's not sustainable. He was almost too hot because what are you going to cast him as?
Too
You can't
hot.
just cast him as some sort of an accountant whistleblower, right? Like he can't play the same roles that a Matt Damon can play because you can make him look like somewhat nebbish sometimes.
I would have actually loved to see Brendan play exactly that back then, but you're totally right. Now, after Encino Man and School Ties came with honors, an entirely forgotten movie co-starring Joe Pesci.
Great movie.
You know what? Yes, thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And Patrick Dempsey, and we both highly recommend it. Then there was Airheads, The Scout, a series of similar types of movies. But what really made him a household name were the movies that came next, beginning in 1997 with the live-action George of the Jungle, in which Brendan may just be his prettiest. He rarely wears a shirt, obviously, because he's essentially Tarzan. He's long-haired, he's filthy, he's very dumb. It's delicious. And he falls in love with Leslie Mann, who plays an American heiress who stumbles into him in, the jungle. Was the movie good? It doesn't matter. It was really fucking fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. It was Brendan's bread and butter, and it's a genre I miss now, jokes aside. So then came The Mummy, which is an absolutely phenomenal action adventure with minimal and far superior CGI to a lot of today's action films, I'd say. Jungle Cruise wishes. Co-starring the wonderful Rachel Weisz, it was the moment for Brendan. Not only was he ridiculously handsome, let me wipe my brow, but he and Rachel shared a sweet chemistry and were both so funny in what, by all rights, should have just been a kid's movie, but oozed the kind of sex appeal we're lucky to find in most action movies today. Brendan was cast because he reminded director Stephen Sommers of Errol Flynn, and as he told Empire in 1999, his character, quote, doesn't take himself too seriously, otherwise the audience can't go on that journey with him, end quote. In other words, he was perfectly cast. Here's a brief clip where he sums up this role, and frankly, most of his others at the time, in an interview that same year with Joe Lydon.
Our director, Stephen Sommers, would say, run fast, look like a stud, and don't die. So all I had to do was just sort of show up to work and do that.
Now, in those years, he also dabbled in what can best be called sex comedies with a massive dose of weirdness. There was Still Breathing, Blast from the Past, like we discussed, and Bedazzled, which co-starred Elizabeth Hurley as the devil who gives his character 7 wishes to win the girl of his dreams in exchange for his soul. Now, listen, that's a winning weekend triple feature, and these didn't do quite so well at the box office and not at all well among critics, but they did bank on Brendan's brand and typecasting, and they did gain cult status over the years. One might even say Brendan was ahead of his time. He also managed to dabble in better and more dramatic fare during this tricky transitional time. with 1998's Gods and Monsters, 2002's The Quiet American, and 2004's Crash. His performance in each won him some raves, but it wasn't easy for him to break out of that box he was so trapped in. And it was difficult to watch him go from goofy to dramatic, I'll admit. We have so many people who followed that path. There was Robin Williams, Jim Carrey, Whoopi, Melissa McCarthy, Bob Odenkirk, and Brendan Fraser didn't quite end up following in that path, but I think he was primed to do so. It just didn't end up, the pieces didn't end up falling in quite the right way. But it also kind of makes you wonder, what exactly did he want to be doing? I mean, Sarah, do you feel a little bit puzzled when you look at his resume?
Yeah, I feel like he didn't have great management. And this is true of a lot of actors, where what's the difference between being a Julia Roberts and being a Monica Keena,
Yeah.
because they look so similar. They're both beautiful women. They're both talented. They're both charming. I mean, part of the difference is timing. Do you have the right vibe for the moment? And part of it is like, just, did someone manage your career trajectory well? Or did you yourself have the instincts to manage it well? And I guess Brendan didn't have the instincts to manage it for himself, and also just didn't have a team that really understood how to make sure he could be successful in the long term. Like, either he wasn't getting good advice, or he just wasn't taking the good advice he was receiving. Like,
I think you're probably totally right. Yes. Careers were a lot choppier back then. They weren't as clean cut as they are now. Now the industry has really sharpened its game, but back then, not so much. Now, from the point of 2004's Crash until 2016, Brendan entered another defining decade, this one incredibly tumultuous. He did a not too shabby Mummy sequel, but a very shabby threequel, which didn't even include Rachel Weisz, by the way, which is a red flag. But it did co-star Jet Li and Michelle Yeoh, so, I'll give Brendan a little bit of kudos. Now, he also did some questionable kids movies, including Looney Tunes Back in Action, yikes, and one called Furry Vengeance, which actually could be considered quite topical because it tells the story of local woodland animals who protest a real estate developer's new housing plans on their land. Cute.
Yeah.
Why not? But behind the scenes, Brendan was not doing well at all. In 2011, he was embroiled in a lawsuit with the producer who he said reneged on promised wages. And his marriage of nearly 10 years with actress Afton Smith had come to an end after 3 children, and the divorce was messy. He was ordered to pay a monthly alimony of $50,000 for 10 years, along with the $25,000 monthly payment for child support. When he petitioned the court in 2013 for a reduction in payments, as he said he was no longer in the financial position to meet those numbers, which, by the way, added up to a whopping $900K per year, Afton accused him of hiding millions in financial assets. And I mean, like, come on, just take one glance at his IMDb page. He was not doing great. The evidence was right there. Now, the chaos didn't stop there. In a must-read 2018 GQ profile in which Brendan finally broke his silence and opened up about all that he went through during this time, he revealed that all the action films he'd done had left a significant impact on his body, which had him in and out of hospitals for 7 years. Brendan said, quote, "By the time I did the third Mummy picture in China in 2008, I was put together with tape and ice, screw cap ice packs, and downhill mountain biking pads because they're small and light and they can fit under your clothes. I was building an exoskeleton for myself daily. I needed a laminectomy and the lumbar didn't take, so they had to do it again a year later," end quote. Then came a partial knee replacement, back surgery, vocal cord repairs. This is a pretty painful line from him from the profile, but it really puts the impact of his work into perspective. Quote, "I felt like the horse from Animal Farm, whose job it was to work and work and work. Orwell wrote a character who was, I think, the proletariat. He worked for the good of the whole. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make trouble until it killed him. I don't know if I've been sent to the glue factory, but I felt like I've had to rebuild shit that I built that got knocked down and do it again for the good of everyone, whether it hurts you or not," end quote. It makes me think a lot about what is demanded of certain actors. Sarah, do you think if he said no early on, it would have impacted his career?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that before CGI was as advanced as it is now, if you were an action star, you basically had to do your own stunts, or they would just cast someone else. And I know Uma Thurman has said similar things about how working on the Kill Bill movies destroyed her body in the long term, that she lives with unbearable physical pain because of it. And we know that this is such a competitive industry. There are so many people who are just as talented as you are, just as good looking as you are, just as charismatic as you are, who are waiting in the wings to take your place. All actors, sadly, are seen by the industry as replaceable. I mean, there are very
Hmm.
few performers that have reached the level where they are deemed irreplaceable. I mean, in this generation, I would say maybe like Tom Hanks, Julia Roberts, like maybe Brad Pitt to some, though not to me. And everybody else has to live with the knowledge that they need to follow orders or they just won't get cast anymore. It's really upsetting because what he's been expected to go through is not fair. But I think if he had refused, they would have found another really handsome, incredibly ripped man.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, they could have even pulled anybody from the School Ties cast at that point. And I
Mhm.
think for me, what is especially interesting is that action stars are the ones who get the least value.
Yeah.
And I think that's because it's a genre that's considered dumbed down and with little depth, but I disagree with that. And I also think if we can put up drama and comedy as these amazing, profound genres, we can do that with this one because not only is there emotional and mental effort that goes into it, but so much physical effort. And God, the impact that these people take on their bodies, whether they have stunt doubles or not, by the way, is really immense. And stunt people, by the way, are also not really given much credit at
Yeah.
all. So that's also something that is so long overdue.
Mhm.
Here's a clip from a 2016 interview with AOL's Build, where Brendan discusses why he decided to take a break from those action movies that essentially broke his body.
I think I was just so game and ready to go no matter what that they figured, well, heck, he's here, he's made up, he's paid for it, we might as well have him jump off the cliff or do whatever he could do. Light him on fire, too. I'd just be like, yep, sure, I'll do another one, no problem. Oh, it didn't hurt that much. Ugh.
This interview, by the way, was conducted just days after the death of Brendan's mother, something we learn much later. In the video, he is markedly different from the actor we're used to. His voice is softer, it's cracking, his eyes are red rimmed, and there's an unmistakable sadness to him. With it also being his first interview in years, clips of it went viral on social media, with many poking fun at his demeanor and questioning if he was sick or if he was upset because two of his former franchises, The Mummy and Journey to the Center of the Earth, had just been remade without him. For the record, he makes it clear in the interview he couldn't care less about this last fact because, again, he'd made a conscious effort to move away from the genre. But his traumas did
Mhm.
not stop there. In that same GQ profile, Brendan revealed that in the summer of 2003, he had been a victim of an alleged sexual assault by former Hollywood Foreign Press president Philip Burke, who he says groped him at a crowded HEFPA luncheon at the Beverly Hills Hotel. The HEFPA, by the way, is the group of stuffy oddballs who host the Golden Globes each year. So just so you know, Philip reached out to seemingly shake his hand, but then Brendan said, quote, his left hand reaches around, grabs my ass cheek, and one of his fingers touches me in the taint, and he starts moving it around, end quote. Overcome with panic and fear, it took him time to process what was happening and wrench the man away. He then ran out of the room and home, even past an officer he couldn't bring himself to confess to. Brendan added, quote, I felt ill. I felt like a little kid. I felt like there was a ball in my throat. I thought I was going to cry. I felt like someone had thrown invisible paint on me, end quote. That last line, I think, really nails what it feels like to be a sexual assault victim and to be afraid to speak. Now, Philip went on to say that Brendan's claims were, quote, a total fabrication. But here's the thing, he wrote him an apology, as was requested by Brendan's team. And here's his douchey follow up comment for GQ about that, by the way. Quote, my apology admitted no wrongdoing. The usual, if I've done anything that upset Mr. Fraser, it was not intended and I apologize, end quote. The HEFPA also said they would ensure the two men would never be in the same room again, though Philip denied this too, and the organization refused to comment to the magazine. Now, what's even more interesting about all of this is that when the incident occurred in 2004, Brendan didn't hide it. In fact, Sharon Waxman, who was a reporter for the New York Times then and later went on to found The Wrap, reported on it. But in a minor aside, in a gossipy feature about, quote, lobbying for Golden Globes, it's mentioned in a list of other incidents involving a HEFPA member being suspended for throwing wine at someone and others being showered with gifts for nothing. In other words, there's a clear implication from that article that this was merely an amusing anecdote from a rowdy group of people and hardly worth mentioning. Sarah, what do you think elevated this moment from an amusing aside to a traumatic report?
Going in his favor was that we were somewhat more sensitive about these things, but also one of the reasons I think this went viral is cynically, I think part of it was that people found it odd, right? We don't live in a society yet where it is considered safe for anyone to talk about sexual assault. It's hard for women to do so, but it's really considered odd when men come forward, right?
Right.
When they feel upset about these things and when they admit to being traumatized and they admit to having been victimized. So I think that it went viral in part because a lot of people, whether they would cop to it or not, felt like it was a weird, bizarre story. They might have felt bad for Brendan, but also it was salacious because it was unusual. But the culture of machismo in the Western world makes it so that men oftentimes have a hard time admitting that they've been victimized. It can be seen as humiliating to be vulnerable like that. And so having one of the most famous action stars of the 90s come forward and say, hey, me too, like this can happen to anyone, I think has a lot of symbolic value.
So, according to the group Stop Street Harassment, who did a survey just in 2018 after the Me Too wave began, 81% of women and 43% of men say they've experienced some form of sexual harassment or assault in their lives, while a significant portion experienced some form of PTSD in their lives afterward. What's really interesting and noting here is that men reporting these sorts of things, that number was way lower just before Me Too. So it just shows you the impact that something like this can have. And when celebrities speak up and come forward, and there's a stigma around sexual assault, but there's an even bigger stigma if you're a man who's been sexually assaulted. And by the way, I think it's also worth noting that it's a strange thing to also see somebody who might be suffering and who is clearly different than they were before and to immediately sort of mock them for it. This is a good reason why it's so important just to ask what's changed or wonder if there might be something going on in their personal life. We shouldn't just immediately rush to making fun. Now, a big part of the reason Fraser waited so long to tell the depth of his story is exactly that. He was afraid it would harm his career. He told GQ, I didn't want to contend with how that made me feel or it becoming part of my narrative. But it stuck with him over the years, and he became depressed, believing that he deserved what happened to him. It made him reclusive and made him disappear from Hollywood. He added, quote, I was blaming myself and I was miserable because I was saying, this is nothing. This guy reached around and he copped a feel. That summer wore on, and I can't even remember what I went on to work on next, end quote. Brandon also said that he often wondered if the HuffPub blacklisted him in the industry as roles dried up and he was no longer invited to the Globes. He said, quote, the silence was deafening. But Philip has denied this, saying, quote, his career declined through no fault of ours. Ouch. Ultimately, Brendan came forward and shared his truth after watching the various women he worked with over the years shared theirs, admiring their courage and the movement itself. Again, Brendan is one of very few men who openly and proudly even acknowledged the Me Too movement without being asked. But here's some fun facts for you. Philip still works at the HEFPA and was there the year of the movement's uprising while Brendan was at home. Brendan said he's still afraid, but felt he needed to say something. That's courage. And that GQ profile, by the way, is what propelled him back to the spotlight and into the hearts of so many of us. I think especially those of us who grew up watching him. He certainly never owed us his story, by the way, but I think in sharing it, he's made a big difference and he's become an even more endearing figure than he was before. It's unfortunate, though, that that's what it took. But in case that's brought you down a little, here's an optimistic Brendan speaking to Sway in 2019 about being potentially blacklisted and Me Too.
In a career, we all take turns, you know, and and I also think that things, you know, they seem to happen for a reason. And I know that in the very busy time I had in the early 90s, I reached a point where I wanted to get off the merry-go-round and I wanted to, stop the music and have kids and a family and that kind of thing. And so it kind of worked out that I reprioritized things for me. I'm doing absolutely just fine. And I feel like it's a new day. So I feel good about that. Thanks for asking.
I'm here for it.
Brendan Fraser, ladies and gentlemen.
That makes me smile. Sarah, do you feel like the Me Too movement has been making progress?
I go back and forth on this. In terms of material gains, I mean, okay, Harvey Weinstein has been brought to justice, although like Bill Cosby is now out of prison. So I think it's easier in some respects to talk about being sexually assaulted and to reveal that that happened to you, at least in Hollywood. That's not true necessarily for every industry. There will be some particularly feminist magazines or websites who will come out and defend you. But at the same time, I'm sure there are cases we are not hearing about. It's like when you have an ant infestation and you know for every ant you catch, there are like, 20 or 30 you're not seeing. It's like that. And you know that there are still people who are worried, if I came forward, would I be believed? I mean, Megan Fox gave a great interview a couple years ago where she sort of talked about how she didn't really have a Me Too moment, even though she had experienced severe harassment, especially on, when she was young and doing movies like Transformers, because she wasn't the right kind of victim, quote unquote. Like she felt like feminists wouldn't rally around her. And whether or not that's true, like whether or not that wouldn't have happened at the moment if she'd come forward in 2017, it's hard to tell, although she did come forward, and give that interview not too much time later. And people barely talked about it, right? Like, did you seem vulnerable enough, right? Were your politics the right kind of politics? Was your look the right kind of look? So I mean, like any movement, it's going to take a long time before it really actually changes things. I'm glad it started, but it has not finished, right? I mean, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, when it comes to Me Too, we're kind of at the end of the beginning.
I love that you got Winston Churchill in there. I am completely in agreement with you. I think in ways that we can't see, it is definitely making a difference. For example, in that survey that shows us that more men and women are reporting their assaults than they did before, because we can't say necessarily because of the movement, but it certainly seems in line with it because it happened just after 2018. So that's something, but I agree with you. Progress is very, very glacial because this has been happening for so long. And the fact that Megan Fox made those comments literally just a few years ago and nobody responded to it in the same way they would today is absurd. It just shows you that sometimes even social justice can only happen at the right time. And that's terrible. That's a really difficult pill to swallow. Because again, when Brendan talked about this or in the early OOs, nobody blinked at it. Like it was just ridiculous. So it takes time. And I think that's the hard part. And I think it's great that it started. Unfortunately, we do need people like celebrities to get on their soapbox and say something about it because those are the people who we all hear from and their voices carry. So it is really important. So the next time you hear a celebrity speak up about their truth, don't start thinking that it's not their place. It's got to be their place. We actually need them to do this. By the way, sir, why do you think somebody like Philip Burke still has a job at the HFPA? How is that allowed?
The HFPA sucks, right? Like, they're not even going to have their award ceremony televised anymore because they're awful.
They're terrible. They're terrible. They are literally very well-paid people who just want to hang out with celebrities. They want to have like a drink with George Clooney. That's who those people are, just FYI.
They nominated The Tourist for Golden Globes just because they wanted to hang out with Angelina Jolie and Johnny Depp. Like, they're so desperate to be part of the cool clique. Anyway, they're awful. They're terrible.
And wait, by the way, though, do we think that Brendan's career was impacted by this? Do we feel like maybe he was blacklisted?
It's not beyond the realm of possibilities. Like, I think that is possible because the same thing has happened to many women who were assaulted. So I don't find that hard to believe. Do you?
Yeah, no, not at all. I think it can seem a little strange, but I think when you really look at it closely, it's completely possible and probably did happen because first of all, the Me Too movement and Weinstein only got exposed because of what we call now a quote unquote whisper network, which was people would kind of whisper things to each other. It eventually traveled, got to the right people, got to the right reporters who exposed it. I think the same thing happens when people do get blacklisted or when rumors travel. It's the exact same thing. because the HFPA is a group of people who literally just hobnob around with famous people. So possible that this guy, Philip Burke, who has no problem letting anything out of his mouth, would have said something about Brendan and it would have traveled. Because as you said, it happens to female actors all the time. And by the way, it also happens to us normal people who work in offices all the time. People whisper, these things get around, and it keeps certain people from getting to certain ranks, if you will. So I think it could have happened to Brendan. Now, I've got even better news. There's more reason to be optimistic for Brendan Fraser, a lot more reason. Around the time of his reveal, he kicked off a brand new era. This one devoid of the pinup action star, of even the goofball antics, and entirely comprising that very real inner darkness, this time on television, where he's really gotten to flex those muscles. It began with his joining the third season of Showtime's The Affair, which is an equally messy and fascinating series that will require therapy once you're through. But in it, he played a violent prison guard. It was quite a shock to see him in that role. He played similarly chilling characters in FX's Trust alongside Donald Sutherland and Hilary Swank, and in the series Condor alongside William Hurt and Mira Sorvino. And he does get to have fun, by the way, in case you're worried about that, with DC's beloved Doom Patrol, in which he voices Robot Man. I know when I started watching this new side of him, it was disorienting, but these performances also stay with me in a way his others never could. Here he is again, speaking with AOL Build about this transition.
You know, you can be pigeonholed or boxed as an actor and not really know what the public's perception is of you, or should you play to a certain strength, or well, that answer is yes, but should you stretch and grow and try new things, and that's also the answer too.
Sir, do you think Brendan is tapping into his trauma in this new era of his career? Because we can't say for certain, but the mirroring doesn't seem accidental, and that's not uncommon for artists.
No, absolutely not. I mean, they always say to explore your emotional depths when you're taking on a role and to try to relate to it. So that's probably what he is doing. And I, like you, have been very impressed by his new work, and I'm happy that he's making a return to the career that he loves. Like, good for him that you want to see these things. It gives you hope that sexual assault doesn't have to ruin your life forever. Like, I'm happy that he is succeeding, and I'm also grateful to him that he is creating a dialogue about what it's like to be a man who's been sexually assaulted. Go, Brendan.
Yeah. And, I know it's a controversial statement to make, but I do think great art can come out of great pain. And I mean, come on, we all know the best songs come out of breakups. I'm sorry to say it. But, and it's also the first time where I think I look at what he's doing and I understand what he wants to be doing, right? I mean, and there's also such a catharsis in being able to play characters like this, I would assume. I can definitely say that as a writer. So it's a really beautiful thing to get to see him also be allowed to make this shift, because Hollywood doesn't really allow people to break out of their boxes, does it? I mean, I can't think of very many actors who've pulled this off, although I do think TV has really lent this to a lot of people in recent years. Like you mentioned Chris O'Donnell earlier. He has a whole life on television that he never had in movies. And Bob Odenkirk, too, by the way, in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. There's a new life on television. That's the place to be. And you can be sad or you can be funny. Now, yes, Brendan's career is no longer on a decline, as Philip Burke so confidently assumed. Not only did he star in those critically acclaimed series, but this year he made a phenomenal appearance in Steven Soderbergh's No Sudden Move alongside heavy hitters Don Cheadle and Benicio del Toro. He was also recently cast in Darren Aronofsky's The Whale, Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, and Max Barbacow's Brothers. Yeah, no big deal. I mean, this is growth. This is success. This is winning. We are witnessing someone about to explode for the second time, sure. But I'd wager this is also the best time a Fraser-essence? I don't know. It's a Brendessence. We're in it. What's happening? As the internet and a whole new generation have begun to discover him, they're rallying behind him and have helped bring him back to the surface, proving just how much of a difference a dedicated fan base can be, even years into an actor's career. Take, for example, this past August when a clip of Brendan growing tearful while learning of his fan base went viral. It was during a meet and greet hosted by TikTok user Little Lottie Cosplay. In it, Brendan discusses his upcoming projects, and his nervousness is palpable. It's actually really endearing, and it's also really refreshing from someone who is so high wattage. Here's the clip.
I'm going to work with Scorsese and Leo and Bob De Niro.
Yes, I saw. Congratulations. That's so
Thank you.
exciting.
I think I might be sick. A little anxious.
Oh no.
I mean, it's going to be fun.
You got this. You've got this.
Got it.
Just know that the internet is so behind you. We're so supportive. There are so many people out there who love you, and we're rooting for you, and we can't wait to see what you do next.
Shucks, ma'am.
Now, you can't see Brendan's face, obviously, but his eyes well up with tears, and he is visibly overcome. You can hear it in his voice. He even tips his hat in embarrassment. His so sweet bashfulness won him even more deserved love from the internet and proves why there's always value in being humble and sharing your truth. In the GQ profile, he says at one point, quote, "I was going through things that mold and shape you in ways that you're not ready for until you go through them," end quote. I think that's an incredible lesson. Sarah, what's your takeaway from Brendan's story, and what do you make of his re-rise?
Could we call it a re-Brendan? Does that work? Like rebranding? Re-Brendan? Rebrandening of his career.
There we go.
Yes, he's rebrandening his career.
We just branded his rebranding.
Yes, okay. It's a little clunky. It's no reconnaissance, but I think it'll do in a pinch.
I like it.
You did a great job this episode. You always do a great job, but I really now feel like I totally appreciate this man's oeuvre. I feel like I understand him better than I did before. I wasn't an acolyte, but now I think I am. Our takeaways, I guess, listen, sexual assault is endemic. Hollywood, it happens all the time there, just like it happens all the time everywhere. I really I am impressed with how Brendan Fraser articulately talks about what happened to him, and how he's become an advocate for fellow survivors. That's a great takeaway. I'm also really happy for him that he is growing and changing and transforming. And I'm happy that we now are making space for him in this new form. Also, action movies, the work environment is fucked up. And I'm glad that he and Uma Thurman and other people are starting to talk about that, about how the working conditions, yes, these people are paid a lot of money, but is any amount of money enough money to just completely ruin your physical body? I don't know. I don't think so.
I think for some people, absolutely. As long as you have the money, it doesn't matter what state your body's in, Sarah. Can you spend it? That's the key thing. Now, by the way, I will say another thing that I love about it is, by the way, you can completely retool your whole career at any point in your life. Remember that. And this, by the way, brings us to our final segment, Hindsight is 2021, where we choose the one moment that we might have handled differently if we were the subject of this story.
I shouldn't have done that.
Sarah, what would that be for you?
Well, I would have really nicely asked Rachel to be in The Mummy 3. I feel like it's not a Mummy movie if she's not in it. So, she was probably off making her Oscar-nominated, Oscar-winning movies. Good for her. But I would have called in a favor with my girl Rachel if I were Brendan. What about you?
I love that so much. I actually, and my friend Chris, who's constantly on about The Mummy, we would love a remake. Let's do that, and let's bring Rachel in, and let's see them all these years later. That would be fun. I'm so down for that. Personally, I wish there had been a journalist that made the story what it was meant to be all those years ago when Brendan first shared it, and the Times made it into nothing, which is ironic, by the way, and says a lot, because the Times, along with the New Yorker, are who helped expose Weinstein and kick off Me Too.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it really shows you how much timing matters. But there are so many moments we can trace back to where something like that movement could have started and didn't. There's no way that would have happened today, and I think there's a relief to that. But also I'd add, and this is something I'm always on my soapbox about, but like you said, Sarah, let's please place more value on action stars. They go through so much, they put so much on their bodies and their minds. And I think, we should give them a little bit more value for that, the kudos that they deserve. I know The Rock is huge, but he hurts too. Drama is not the only genre with depth and significance, okay? The Mummy is waiting for you all, and you will see this. And if Brendan Fraser ever taught you anything, let it it be that it's okay to go to the movies and just have some fucking fun. There doesn't need to be anything else to it. That brings us to the end of this episode. Now, our next one, we're going to be chatting Tiger Woods and his tiny, minor, minimal, little cheating scandal. So fun. Now, if you want to hear more from me, you can find me on Twitter at _Sadaf. Sarah, where can our listeners find you?
Listeners can find me at Sarah Sahagian. And if you liked this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe so other listeners can find us too. Thanks for listening.